Hey guys, before we start the show, I just want to give a quick shout out to another podcast.
Welcome, dear reader, to Dispatches from the Armchair.
There's so much news, and the world moves so fast. What are the big ideas and historical forces that are really shaping our world? Go deeper than the headlines with Dispatches from the Armchair.
Well, hello there. Pacific War Channel. The channel will recover the entire Asia-Pacific War of 1937 to 1945 and all the major events that led up to it. And I'm here with my friend John.
Hey, I'm John. I'm from the podcast Dispatches from the Armchair, where we talk about all kinds of history and current events, trying to get a little bit behind the headlines, a little deeper into deeper than like what the obvious things will tell you, trying to get the story beyond what the casuals will tell you, as we like to say. And I'm really excited to be here. Craig, I'm a huge fan of your channel and a huge fan of history, especially, being Chinese myself. I'm a huge fan of any kind of Asian history and a huge military history nerd. So it's a real pleasure to be here to talk about one of probably the greatest shames and humiliations of my people, the First Sino-Japanese War. And I know you said that we are starting off, that your channel covers the Pacific War of 1937. So we're going to start things right here in 1894.
Oh yeah. People, as soon as I started the channel, the first questions I got was like, the first Opium War, the second Opium, what are we doing here? What is this all about? And, in university, that's where my professor started. And that's all I had to say to it. It's like, from an academic standpoint, how do you even touch a war between majorly like China and Japan without talking about the grievances, the major grievances?
Yeah. How did we get here in the first place? I had a very similar situation when I was in, being an American, we call it college. When I was in college, I took a class called Japan. It's called Japan War in the Pacific, and everybody thought it was going to be a class about World War II, but it started off with the Meiji Restoration, and it ended with the invasion of Manchuria.
That's a good course. It
was a great course. It was a great course. Yeah.
And no
one
learns that.
It's sad, but it's true. And I think we're going off topic already, but I think the story of the Meiji Restoration is probably I think that is probably one of the most inspirational stories that I've ever heard. It's the story of somebody who got blindsided by circumstances that they could never have expected, was able to painfully swallow their pride, face up to the changed circumstances, and change, on their own power, in their own initiative, look at the new world that they found themselves in, change almost everything about themselves. But because they were voluntarily took on these changes on their own, instead of having these changes foisted on them from outside, they were able to not only preserve like the aspects of themselves that they hold most dear, but also to excel and compete with all of the new powerful players in this new world that they find themselves in. I think, as personally, as human beings, as individuals, it's so easy for us to just get stuck in our ways, especially as we get older. We find things that work and just kind of shut out outside influences. But, that's dangerous. It might feel comfortable and easy in the moment, but that's the slow road to destruction. Complacency is the road to defeat. Complacency is the road to defeat, just like it says in the StarCraft instruction manual.
Awesome call out. Oh my God, StarCraft. I miss the old days in the 90s. Just
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, funny fact, one of the best players in the world for StarCraft, he lived where I am, and for a long time he
Really?
was the reigning champion. Kiwi, oh my god, his name is Kiwi something. And yeah, he went to all the local tournaments. We got to see him in action. It was crazy.
That's awesome.
He had the throne for 4 years, I think.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing. Yeah,
And I like,
StarCraft, that's not a game for casuals. You got to be a serious gamer to be good at StarCraft.
yeah, and I like what you were saying about the Meiji Restoration because it has a lot to do with this event. Because basically, Japan had the benefit of the doubt because China had undergone two major wars with the West and a major rebellion. So Japan got to see this before they basically got blindsided. And
Yeah.
they basically got to see what happens if they took certain course of actions, which really led to their decision to,
Yep.
like you said, swallow a lot of it. Although they did retain a lot of their culture in unique ways.
Absolutely.
There was one point where the educational minister, Mori Antonori, he actually talked about getting rid of the language and going with English. That crazy.
Oh yeah, yeah. China did the same thing after the fall of the Qing dynasty. They talked about getting rid of Chinese and switching to Esperanto.
Yeah, that would have been
Been
bad
crazy,
choice.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, having read like the Wikipedia page on Esperanto, that was a brave idea. I mean that both in the American sense of like, hey, that's a courageous idea, and in the British sense of like, that's kind of a dumb idea.
It was there was a large group of people that really thought that was going to solve a lot of issues in the world.
I can see where they're coming from. I mean, nowadays in the age of Google Translate, it's kind of easy to dismiss language, like the language barrier, as being inconsequential. But I find, especially, and I'm sure you found this too, especially as you start studying Chinese history, these sources are it's so hard to find good sources from the Chinese perspective because they're all in Chinese and they have not been translated. And you would think that it'd be easy to jump that barrier, but obviously it isn't, because even for me, a ethnically Chinese person, it's hard for me to bridge that gap. And that's one of the reasons I'm studying Chinese now.
Yeah, it's definitely, especially when it came to this one. I actually went with one book because I was having an issue because it's such a politicized war, and both sides, they embezzle what they're saying. I went with a Western scholar, which you shouldn't for any histories of Asia. Ezra Vogel, she wrote China and Japan Facing History. So it was more of a broad spectrum of all the events that happened in Asia. But she went about saying allegedly a lot because she didn't want to take a stand when it came to things. But I found that she called out the Japanese though quite often, which was nice. She had particularly a good way of melding, like, yes, the Qing administration was corrupt and there was a lot of problems, but she's like, also the Japanese are guilty of espionage and stuff as well. I mean, they had their hand to play.
For sure. For this conflict, I drew on a variety of sources, but by far the one I'm going to be drawing on the most heavily today is a book by SCM Payne, The Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, Perceptions, Power, and Primacy. I thought this was a really nice military history book. Yeah. And I especially liked his argument that, in China, they talk a lot about the Opium Wars, but really it's this war, the First Sino-Japanese War, that did most of the things that China wants now to undo. It's this war that caused China to lose control over Taiwan. It's this war that caused China to lose suzerainty over Korea. It's this war that really kind of opened China up to foreign exploitation, even more so than the Opium Wars did. At the time, the Opium Wars, there's reason to believe that the Opium Wars was reviewed inside China as like just another conflict with barbarians on the frontier. But this time, this was like, you just got your ass beat by your little brother. And there's no way to explain that away.
I wanted to name the episode, but someone told me not to go with it. Little Brother Beats Big Brother, or Little Brother Faces Big Brother. But I took away all titles. I just called it what it is, part 1. And part 2, I finished only today, the script.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's safe.
Yeah.
That's safe.
And I know we had wanted to talk a little bit about the Empress Dowager. And,
Oh yes.
interesting information on kind of the myths behind how much can we blame her for when it comes to this. So I'm sure anyone who knows about this event knows that she was particularly blamed for a specific thing. They thought that, you know, when the Beiyang, and please correct me when I say things wrong, because I have to be corrected.
The Beiyang.
Beiyang fleet.
Beiyang.
Beiyang.
There you go. Perfect. Perfect.
That's why I stopped filming with my camera and with a teleprompter and actually did what every other YouTuber does. Slowly reads it out, edits when I mess up. So now I hope to God I will actually fix things. But it has not fixed my English mistakes, which has been funny. Suzerainty? I can't remember what I said. But anyways, she was basically it had to do with the Summer Palace. As we know, they were building up the Summer Palace roughly at the same time. And her birthday was coming up actually in 1894. But the rumor was...
As I'm sure it comes up every year.
Yeah. The rumor was that all of a sudden in about 1889 or 1887 actually, they stopped funding as much money into the fleet.
Right. New ship construction and even ammunition and maintenance for the existing ships.
Oh, yeah. I'll say it a bit.
Yeah.
I had a guy who commented one of the funniest things ever. He commented that he was told by one of his grandfathers that some of the munition shells for the ships turned out to be concrete blocks.
Oh yeah.
Someone had embezzled or like just.
Oh yeah. Concrete, sawdust. That's the stories I heard growing up too. So
they're true. They are true. It did happen.
Okay.
But when she retired, and quote unquote, she never really did. When she gave the reign over to the emperor,
cough.
Yeah, she told him under explicit orders to continue funding the fleet. She actually never specifically, I mean, this is all alleged, I guess, at this point, said to, you know, take funds, put into the Summer Palace. What actually ended up happening was he himself had a few advisors with him who did not take Japan seriously. And that sounds bizarre. I even went on the wiki page, which now has something written about this, because I said this sounds like they're brushing over something. But the advisors, they never looked at Japan seriously, even when the whole Korean situation was coming about.
And 这个小倭人.
We'll talk about that. And like most times in the Chinese history, there's always natural disasters. Like, it's unbelievable. These natural disasters happen at the worst times, and so much money had to be used to cover some major flooding and an earthquake, I believe.
Oh.
And
Okay.
There was a rebellion, actually, a concurrent. Well, I mean, there was a few rebellions that were going
The
on.
late Qing is full of rebellions.
Yeah.
Rebellions and natural disasters. That's no doubt about that.
So allegedly, a lot of these funds actually went there, and that's what some of the sources are saying today. But I mean, it's still all alleged. Because
Interesting.
The traditional
Interesting.
story was that she had embezzled money to go pay for her summer palace.
Right. That is, I think that's the story that every Chinese person was raised on, demonizing the Dowager Empress Cixi. And I, as I mentioned to you, like right before we started recording, she committed the cardinal sin of being a woman in Chinese history, which means that she is not getting away with anything, whether she did it or not. So, you know, in China being a traditionally Confucian patriarchal society, to have a woman ruling is considered like almost like the archetypal evil. It's up there with like appointing your second or third son to be your successor as like some of the worst things you could possibly do.
I mean, there were some sources that called her a witch.
I'm sure that's not the worst thing that they called her.
Like, I've seen some very crazy stories, because a lot of the things I read are written at certain points in time, even in like the time that they were, some of them are primary sources, and my God, everything is misspelled. Oh, my script, if anyone could see it, I have the like old spelling of a lot of the places. Like,
the old Wade Giles.
Yeah, like SOOCHOW for Zhujiao.
Oh yes, Su Chao instead of Suzhou.
And I, thank God, I actually like took the time to really find the more modern spellings, and I am using the modern spellings for almost everything.
The pinyin,
it's too
good.
confusing.
Yeah. The old spelling, the Wei Jiao spelling, it theoretically is easier for an English-speaking person to pronounce, assuming you're going to try and pronounce it in the Chinese or the Cantonese dialect. But the pinyin system is, I mean, made by Chinese people to pronounce the Chinese language. It's got some rules that you have to learn, but once you learn them, they're completely consistent all the way through. And you don't have to deal with like apostrophes or any other kind of weirdness, all those double S's and stuff. So it's, all respect to Misters Wade and Giles. They did the best they could at the time, and we probably owe them a great debt. But now in 2021, we got Pinyin, so let's use that. It does the job a little better.
The most brutal had to be, there was one book I read on both Opium Wars, and it significantly covered the Taiping Rebellion. And it had primary source documents, and I got to see what people were trying to spell out when they found places, and that was really funny.
Yeah, I can imagine that Navy officers hearing Chinese for the first time and like trying to report on where they are. They probably don't have they can't Google the proper Wei Jiao spelling of something. They're just trying to get this message and then go fight tomorrow's battle.
And incredibly, every primary source from British officers, never a casualty on their part. It's magical, yet
magical.
I can look at the sources and see how many men showed up into China and how many men left. And I can tell you that, yeah, a lot of people died.
Interesting.
They would make it sound like every time a single British redcoat was killed, it had to be an accident. A lot of cases of, there was a powder keg, it accidentally went off and we lost a few men. Never that the opponent who was fighting us actually killed a few of us.
Oh, that's a really good point, because I think most of the sources that you get on like Wikipedia, they just take the British primary sources at face value. So that's why you get these stories of like incredibly lopsided casualty figures. But at the end of the day, those casualty figures, there's kind of like, those are pretty much details. Those are petty numbers. We know the result of the war, and that's not in any kind of dispute. Although, and I'm sure we can get into this in more detail, the imperial throne in Beijing at the time did not even know the results of the battles as they were happening. Famously, they had to call in a foreign advisor to come and talk to the emperor so he could find out for himself, like, hey, are we winning or losing? What is actually going on over there?
Yeah, it was the battle over Port Arthur. They had no idea the fleet had not been it wasn't fully destroyed by that point, but it was knocked out. They didn't know for a long time.
Yeah, that's it's tragic. I don't think there's another word to describe it. That the Chinese had a system then, and actually from the past too, of beheading defeated generals, which is a great way to get rid of loyal but unsuccessful commanders, and also a great way to make sure you don't get good information from your dudes in the field.
Yep, it really was. And I mean, I didn't want to go into it. Actually, it's going to be in part 2. I had an episode where I talked about basically how the system of the Qing military works with the 8-banner army, the Green Standard Army, and now after the Taiping Rebellion, we have quite the militias like the Wei Army. I don't know if the Jiang Army still was around after that, because you only hear about the Wei, and then there was the Braves.
The Huai Army, you mean?
Oh, Huai, sorry, yeah. Yi Hongzhang's baby, which was the best fighting army in the war, and it was the minority, and it fought the most battles for everybody.
Yeah. I think that's important to understand when you're talking about China and Japan in this conflict. Japan at this point had a national army that was funded. Standardized weapons, funded through regular sources that it could rely on and bank on in terms of like its growth and investment and whatnot. Meanwhile, poor Li Hongzhang, he had to pretty much beg for every dollar that he could get a hold of, and it showed. It showed in the effectiveness of his weapons. The men, even the infantry with their small arms, they couldn't count on their cartridges having the correct type of powder to fire, to the proper range, or sometimes even to fire at all. And just like you said, with the artillery shells of the ships, just not reliable. And I think when you're taking the national army against what's essentially a feudal army, you have like the army of a duke who's trying to raise funds on his own. It's not a contest. I've often said that nationalism is the most powerful idea to ever exist. And at this time, the Japanese had it in spades, and the Chinese did not. In all of history, there has no force with nationalism has ever lost to a force without nationalism. No nation has ever lost to a non-nation except once. And that's in the largest conflict in history. That's the Eastern Front of World War II. So
yes,
that's the asterisk, but it's a big one.
Actually, I can explain to the audience because I know for Westerners, this is something that's completely overlooked. You look at Japan. Japan had its, now it's a prefecture system, used to be domains. When Japan sent its army, it wasn't, oh, here's a bunch of guys from Choshu, here's a bunch of guys from Tosa, and they fight as a whatever regiment. No, they are Japanese now. They have a unity, patriotic. But for the Chinese, already you got 8-banner army, Green Standard Army, militias. You have all these different groups, but they're coming from different regions with different dialects. They have no affinity for each other, no reason to fight for their fellow brother. This is some guy, maybe you had a rebellion against him, maybe he's your enemy in that territory. So this mishmash shows up to the battle, and some of them are fully modernized, some of them are medium, and some of them are archaic.
And don't forget, the Chinese armies, they're all brought together to fight for a Manchu, to fight for another kind of foreigner. I think in the book that I cited by S.C.M. Payne, there's a section at the very end where they interview a Chinese American, and he basically says, hey, these Chinese people, they can't say this in China because they're going to get beheaded if they do, but why would they fight? Like, what do they care whether they're ruled by a Japanese king or a Tartar king? At least it looks like the Japanese kings are doing a good job ruling over the Japanese people.
Yeah, it's actually, because I just finished my script for part 2, so I talk really in depth about the blame game when it came to the administration. So it's Manchu run, like you say. They actually chose Li Hongzhang. Is that how you pronounce it?
Li Hongzhang. His name is pretty cool because his name is Li Hongzhang. Li is the surname, of course, and Hong means like great or vast, but it also has the implication of a swan, so like a vast swan. And I forget what Zhang is. Hang on, let me just look it up real quick. The Zhang is it's means like order or rule or regulation. So his parents had high hopes for him.
So he was a Han Chinese.
Yes,
he wasn't Manchu.
He's Han Chinese, correct.
When they had to send envoys who were legally allowed to affix a seal, they had only 2 choices that Japan gave them, and Japan was very smart about this.
Yeah, they're no dummies.
Prince Gong, who was Manchu, or Li, who's a Han. So they sent the Han because they knew, and it's played into their history, at least it wasn't a Manchu who would sign these terrible treaties, so they could blame not just him, but the fact that he's a Han Chinese. So they could place the blame away from them, because everyone hated the Manchu. Well, not everyone, but there's a really large sentiment against Manchus at this point.
Yes,
and they knew it would get worse if a Manchu did it. So the blame game played out, and then it even goes to the Dowager Empress. Like they all these people are trying to shift blame around. No one wants to actually take responsibility.
Right. I think that's one of the biggest weaknesses of the Chinese state at this time. It's that everybody is looking out for themselves. They're all trying to save their own neck, and nobody is willing to step forward and be like, hey, I want to do what's best for the empire, for the country. Because
except for Li.
Yeah, except for Li. And he got amply rewarded, quote unquote rewarded, for his efforts.
God, it's heartbreaking at the end, because the source I have talks about the personal conversations he had with Ido Hirobumi at the end.
Yeah.
And it's like they I mean, not to call them friends, although it does seem like they were personally pretty close, because they had worked on previous negotiations. They actually spoke to each other in English. What's funny is when they did the treaty for this war, Li brought an interpreter, because I guess for appearance sake, he needed to like put a wall between him. And it makes sense because their nations were at stake. But he asked, It's so tragic. At the very end,
Hmm.
Ito said to him, you know, in 1886, before this all started, you threatened me and you said that our countries might go to war. And I told you that you need to get your country to modernize. And Lee said, I tried. But it's the conservatives that were in power in my country and they just thwarted my efforts. He's like, I really did everything I could. And then he asked him, if we had switched places, what would you have done? And Ito said, I could not have done as well as you. That was the end of the treaty signing.
Oh
So,
man, manly tears.
yeah, it's like you had mentioned when we talked before, like there was a bit of a bromance. It really does seem so, but it's tragic because when when he signed this and he went back home and he got almost all of his titles taken away from him, he vowed to never set foot on Japanese soil again. And a few years after, he was in harbor in Japan and he didn't get off the ship because he had made this stance.
Oh
So
wow.
really,
Wow.
like he fought his entire life to basically modernize the empire, and then he gets blamed. It's incredible, the irony behind it.
Yeah, I mean unfortunately that's what sometimes happens, right? Like if you set out to try and do something good, but you're not given the sufficient resources to do it, then even when you fail, then that's enough for the people who didn't help you anyways to be like, oh, see, it was a bad idea all along. But of course, personally, you still got to try your best to do what's right. Consequences be damned. Like if there was no Li Hongzhang, then what would have become of the Manchus, right? Then what would have become of the Chinese state?
He was, I mean, he had control, like most of these regional warlords in essence. He had control over his little army, and he did modernize
his own little pocket. But he was not allowed to gain control over any national system because that would allow a Han Chinese too much power, and then he could depose the dynasty.
Yeah, you know, the Dowager Empress actually she was given flack for hiring him, but it was traditional apparently to put a Han Chinese in the exact position he was in because it was like the certain level of respect just to keep everyone happy, because you couldn't have Manchus in every great position, I think.
Yeah, you got to do a little bit of dividing and conquering.
Yeah, but it's really his legacy. I mean, he's like one of the greatest heroes of the Taiping Rebellion, and then he forms what is almost the only modernized army that did anything at that point. And then he's the only guy really. His army ends up fighting all the battles in this war, and he's the only one who really did anything.
Yeah, and he's fighting headwinds from the imperial court the whole time. Even like from the moment like he lost the first battle, there were people saying, hey, your modern weapons are no good, obviously, because you lost this battle. We never lost battles like this when we were using like these old-timey like muzzle loading 2-person jingals. Why don't we go back to those?
God, those are so funny.
Yeah, and then anybody who stands up for him, they get accused of being not patriotic enough, like not Chinese enough. Kind of like in America, if you didn't support the war on terror, then you were accused of being like not American enough. I think that impulse, that's common to all humans. If you don't support like the traditional thing, then your manhood is called into question.
It's so true.
Yeah, the most I think the most heartbreaking part, looking forward into history, was during those negotiations when Li Hongzhang asked Ito Hirobumi, like, hey, why don't we Asian people work together and deal with like the European, like the white people who are coming to prey on us both? And Ito is basically like, dude, that sounds nice, but I gotta work with the winners here.
I mean, before the war happened, they were on the same page with that. Even the diplomats in Korea, they all had this idea, because the fear was Russia. This whole time, they saw the Trans-Siberian Railway coming in. They saw that Russia really wanted a warm water port in Asia, which it was threatening. And Russia was positioning itself just above Korea. So from the Japanese point of view, it's like, Korea is a paper castle. It could be taken in a matter of weeks. Yeah. This enemy country could just take Korea and trample over us. And they thought,
snapping their fingers.
They thought the Qing dynasty, they thought that the Chinese probably wouldn't be able to do anything about it. So they couldn't trust that China's hold over Korea was going to last. And it sounds weird in retrospect, because a lot of scholars, I mean, today they think they try to go back in time and they say this is the time when Japan was like evil and they're planning this all along. And the rumor was that like before the war kicked off, Japanese businessmen were in China gathering information. Allegedly, it was because of Chinese market opportunities, because the market was growing. They were trading in the 1880s. They thought it was going to get better. But
Yeah, China was pretty rich prior to the start of this war, right?
oh yeah, I mean they bought 2 German battleships that scared the
Yeah.
hell out of the Japanese.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Japanese, they ended up getting all this information on whatever was the Chinese market, and the market happened to be military installations. And you can look at it and you can already tell like the Japanese had intelligence over the Chinese. And then when you look at the other side of the coin, it just, for some reason, other than Lee, no one in Beijing actually gave a shit about Japan. They didn't have any real good intelligence on what was going on. They weren't prepared. So
Yeah.
there was reports from military officers from the Chinese side when they were fighting in Manchuria. They said that the Japanese had better maps than them.
Oof.
Yeah.
Oof. Oof.
Yeah.
That's brutal. That's
And
brutal.
this has led World War II scholars in China to believe that this was all planned and this was the great invasion of China that we'll see. And I give them some leeway. Yeah, of course there could be, of course, it's a country that's modernizing and it did have ambitions like that. I mind you, at that point in time, I don't think they were thinking that far ahead, but yeah.
I mean, I think when you look at the Second Sino-Japanese War, it's clear that there was no like overarching imperial will guiding the Japanese people at the time. They kind of got yanked into that war by an impulsive and aggressive military, and by a civilian government that was afraid of getting assassinated if they said anything against the military.
The assassinations are incredible. Those stories from the 20s and 30s.
Yeah. But that story is not going to get any headway in China at all. When I mentioned this story, when I mentioned this to my own parents, they got angry with me. They're like, "What?" Like, as if I was like trying to defend the Japanese, the Japanese during this time. So I backed off of that one quick. I was like, ugh.
What did you grow up calling the war? Because I actually did an episode talking about how the definition and what World War II or the Pacific War is called by the countries is completely different. And China has some of the most interesting titles for it.
I mean, I grew up in America, so I learned the American version of the story first. So to me, originally, it was just World War II. But when I talked to like my Chinese tutor, then they mainly call it the 抗日战争. 抗 is like the resist,
The war of
or
resistance.
to fight. Yeah, and 日 is of course short for 日本, Japan. So basically the war, the anti-Japan war, or the war of resistance against Japan.
Yeah, it's been called also, the longest one was the war of resistance against Japanese fascism. That was
That
a very long one.
Sounds like it's shorter in Chinese.
Yeah. And then the Japanese, of course, they just see it as like you always translate to the Sino-Japanese War, because from their point of view, it was a war in Asia, and they don't want to talk about the other side, because Japan is like, we never had this war in the Pacific with America.
Yeah. I'm sure we can get into the Japanese views of history. We can go pretty deep into there.
Yeah, they just pretty much dig in their backyard, take their history books, throw it in there, and say it never happened. I mean, for the longest time, it was like that. I don't blame them, I guess, for being like. Well, I mean, they have to tell their citizens something at some point, but yeah.
I mean, all history is political, right?
Mm.
And especially when it's taught in schools, history isn't taught to educate. History is taught as an adjunct to nation building. So when you teach history, you're not really telling the story of what happened. What you're doing is telling people telling people who they are, not what happened in the past, who they are and why they are. So that's why history textbooks are always such a contentious topic here in America and abroad. And I'm sure, well, I was going to say I'm sure they're contentious in Canada too, but I just feel like Canadians just are nice to everyone.
The biggest one is the War of 1812 because I mean it's that one thing that Canadians, and we weren't even in Canada at the time, we like to hold over the United States. It's like, oh, we got to burn down it was the Brown House before the White House, but it was
Turn it
actually
black.
native allies who did it. But everyone, Canada's like, yeah, it was us. It's like it was British soldiers and some native allies. It wasn't really the Canadians. So.
But now we're best friends, so we're still cool, right?
Yeah, we have that monument up. It's just on the border. It's like, we'll never go to war again, it says. Yeah.
Against anyone or just against America?
No, against like Canada and America. We're forever allies.
Oh, okay.
The only time we didn't directly jump into conflict was Iraq. We instead went to Afghanistan. That was like the first time we broke that agreement, I guess.
I think that's a good time to do it. Vietnam would have been good too.
Oh man, yeah. No one really. It's funny. I work on an Aboriginal reservation. We have a ton of Nam vets. I don't know why it's so many of the community I work for. A lot of them went to Vietnam.
Interesting.
We have a bunch of
Aboriginals that went to Nam.
Yeah, I work for a Mohawk reserve. So they kind of are, not to call them like more of a warring tribe, but they have a reputation, honestly, amongst the other, like the Algonquins, the other tribes. It's like the Mohawks, so they're the warriors. They're the ones who fought the big wars. So yeah, they have a lot of World War II vets, a lot of Vietnam vets.
Well, two questions I wanted to ask about that. Number one, did Nam vets receive the same rough treatment after the war that in Canada that they did in America?
Ooh, that's a good question, because Canada and the United States have differences when it comes to this, but in Canada, you can't get away no matter what going after veterans. That's like a no. We have like a British mentality about the vets. So I want to say it wasn't as bad, but the time period, we had the hippie movement too. So I think they probably did do some bad stuff.
But probably due to like the different press rules that it didn't get the same coverage that it did in America.
Well, yeah, but the atrocities that happened, and then the American government was like, "Oh, it was marijuana induced," or like, okay.
likely. The second question I want to ask is, so most casuals, they hear Mohawk and they think of the hairstyle. Does the hairstyle come from the people?
Good question. Because a lot of the members, the males, have the traditional hairstyle, but oh my God, I don't know myself because. I had to do Aboriginal history, but I didn't specialize in Mohawk culture. I really like South America, so I learned more Aztecs. That was always my thing.
Everybody likes Aztecs.
No, because all the Algonquins I see have Mohawks too. So I guess back then probably that's what they were known for. It's what dignified their look. But for Aboriginals way back before the Europeans showed up, you refer to people based off of their location to you. So Ottawa, which is in Canada, they call them Ottawa because it means like they're on that side of the river, but it's from the point of view of the people in the south. So
it's like saying northerner.
Yeah, but the people over there don't call themselves Ottawa; they call themselves whatever. That's why for my community, they can be Ganyagea people, they can be the Ongwe people if you want. There's a lot of different titles.
Interesting. Exonyms.
Yeah, a lot of different names. It's so confusing.
There's one tribe. There's one tribe in America in the United States of America that's known by a word that translates into enemy, right? I can't remember what tribe that is. Like they're commonly known by an exonym given to them that translates into enemy because
in French or in English.
In like the native language by which they're commonly known, because they're primarily known. I guess like the white settlers primarily had contact with Tribe A, who did a lot of fighting against Tribe B, so they called Tribe B enemy. So the white settlers just assumed that Tribe B was called enemy.
It's really complex because, like you said, I'm calling them Mohawks. They refer to themselves. The name for their own people is the people of the flint, of the rock, because they had used a type of rock where they were. But
that makes sense.
The idea that their hair piece was like the most defining thing for them probably wasn't relevant. Their enemies called them Mohawks probably because they're like, look, hairstyle, that's Mohawk.
Oh yeah, it'd be like calling all Englishmen neckties.
Yeah. Oh, in French, it's so stupid. What the French used to call the British officers the tête carrée, the squareheads. It's because of the hats and everything they wore.
That's
To
funny.
this day, it's a slur against the English. Which, I am, people wonder, despite the fact I mess up in English all the time, I am not French. And, there's all sorts of bizarre things. And there's even really weird racial slurs that you find, especially in French. French is one of the most racially slurred language you'd ever imagine.
I can imagine. The French did a lot of fighting and they did a lot of winning. So I imagine they've earned the right to look down on all kinds of different people.
You know, when you look at history, it's like the French, for most human history, dominant, always won every war. And then World War II happens. It's like,
Yeah, except for the big one. Yeah.
Forget all their history.
Yeah, yeah. At least in the Anglosphere.
Oh, for sure. The English will never let them off the hook.
Oh yeah. I had an English roommate once, and England, for the last 100 years, England has had problems with Germany. It's had problems with Russia. But when I talk to him about how he feels about the Germans and the Russians, he's like, "Oh, cool, but stuff the French."
Yeah, no, it really is like that. It's funny. Like, they can get over the massive bombing raids from the Germans that killed most of my family, mind you. Like, if I'm talking my Nana, God rest her soul, if she heard I dated a German woman for 2 years and I almost emigrated to Germany, she'd probably lose it.
I won't tell her.
Yeah. Oh boy. Germany's a lovely country, by the way. It's very, very fun. Very fun.
I've never been, but I imagine it's beautiful. I just think it's funny that, as far as my former roommate is concerned, the last 100 years of friendship, whatever, stuff the French.
It's funny because the French are like their greatest ally. To this day, you say, America, of course, but the French have really been there for them for a long time.
Yeah, I on Dispatches from the Armchair, we did a podcast on England, and one of the things that we pointed out is that the English nation is in many ways born out of this conflict with France. Like, to be English is in many ways is to be not French.
Well, there is a reason for it, because like in the history when England was founded, most of the legal writing was in Latin. Then it was put in French, and it was a long time before it was English.
When England was founded, you mean like after 1066?
Oh God, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it goes like England goes.
Founded is a funny term when you're talking about
Normans. They are French in essence. I mean, unless you're like, oh, I'm a Bretonian, of like one of the Celt tribes that survived or something. But
yeah.
If you're from Wales, I guess you are.
And the motto of the King of England is in French, isn't it?
Yeah, probably. Yeah,
Dieu et mon droit. Am I saying that correctly?
Say it again.
Dieu et mon droit. God and my right.
God and my right. Droit would be right.
Droit.
Actually, I'm embarrassed. I don't even know
Dieu et mon droit.
what the saying is. I completely forget it. But yeah, you are to my right. It's like Dieu et mon droit. Yeah.
Oh man, this woodcut. There is some sick Japanese art from this period. I gotta hand it to him.
I always pull, all my thumbnails end up being the wood blocks because they're just so beautiful looking.
Yeah.
I have to say though, some of the paintings of the you can't see it here, but the Chinese running, you can see like some super racism put in there. Where I don't know if I have one of the pictures where they literally make them look like children. There's one I found. I was like, wow, that's really bad.
I mean, if the Chinese had their own artists at the front lines, then we could hear from them. But to our everlasting shame, we didn't even have enough bullets, let alone artists or reporters or journalists. So we forfeited our voice in this conflict due to the corruption and incompetence of the House Ai-Xin-Jie-Luo.
Lee was asked a question about journalists in his country and about the truth, and he made a funny remark in English. He's like, unlike in America where it's the truth, something about the truth and only the truth, he's like, you can't have that in my country because no one could possibly write that without being killed. It was an American correspondent who's asking about like news outlets in China versus in America, and it was a funny story. I don't know where I had found it.
Yeah, there were if the emperor himself can't get accurate dispatches from the front, there's no chance for any journalist. And at the time, the literacy rate in China was so abysmal anyways, and the status of soldiers was so low that good luck getting any information out of them.
By any chance, and it's on the wiki page if people are curious, but because the war was only declared after basically the one of the first naval battles. So when they declared official war, it was the two emperors who were declaring it to the people. Have you seen it by any chance?
I don't think I have. I
It's
might have like
interesting.
skimmed over it once, but not recently.
To brutally summarize, the Japanese write like any politician to today. It's like, we are speaking to the great nations of the world, the family of nations, projecting that, oh, we are one amongst you. You can really see that they're trying to make themselves to be a world power. But the Chinese emperor, he uses the slur that you taught me for Japanese exclusively, and he says it like 20 times, and he's like, those indecent
Eastern dwarves.
Yeah, it's like they they attacked us, surprise attacked us, they broke these treaties. We're just trying to protect our vassal Korea. And it's like the Japanese point out in theirs, Korea's an independent state. They shouldn't be in this vassalhood anymore. Like they're like saying this to the world. So the emperor dropped the ball.
They're
with the
totally
wording.
independent for us to attack them if we want to. It's got nothing to do with you anyways.
Yeah. It's incredible the differences of tones between the two emperors, and you're like, wow, this is really political.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of blame gets heaped on the Manchu ruling house for their inability to effectively modernize, including by me. So, justified and unjustified. But to their, in defense of the Manchus, they were dealing with challenges far beyond what the Japanese ruling class had to deal with. Like, not only they are the number one target for all of these predatory Western imperialists, while Japan basically gets to like sit on the sidelines, make friends with England, like the biggest, scariest imperialist of them all.
Yeah.
Also, like, Japan is a much smaller, physically smaller country that is bounded by the ocean. So in order to exert state power over this much smaller space, it's just logistically so much simpler. Meanwhile, China is incredibly vast, and worst of all, it's ruled by this alien dynasty who can't, these Manchus, they can't implement some far-reaching changes because they have to cling to these traditional Chinese ideas in order to maintain their legitimacy on top this like enormous Han ethnicity that they have to rule over. So it's even if they had the best of intentions with their reforms, which I can't say that they necessarily did, the challenges they faced are so much greater than those that the Japanese faced that they would have needed generations of strong central leadership and focused effort in order to make something happen. And in the end, we're kind of jumping way ahead now to the time period, the original time period of your channel. But Chiang Kai-shek, he gets a lot of flack for being corrupt and incompetent, justifiably. But in his defense, he's ruling through this cobbled together Game of Thrones-esque collection of warlords who barely listened to him anyways. It took like the complete revolution of the communists, like reaching, bypassing all of the traditional institutions of power and going directly to the people. When you're going to the people, you're going right to the very fount of power itself. You're like tapping directly into the source. Only then was Mao Zedong able to truly unify China. And speaking of nationalism, nationalism is an idea that we in the West completely take for granted. But when you read accounts of Chairman Mao during the Second Sino-Japanese War and during the Chinese Civil War, probably 80% of the man hours spent by the Red Army were spent educating the people, trying to like awaken the spirit of nationalism amongst the population. That consciousness, that wokeness, to use a modern term, that was like the essential element in the war.
Well said. And there's a YouTube channel called Alternate History Hub, and I believe they touched
Ooh,
this. They touched.
I might have seen that video.
Is it the one where what if Mao didn't pull it off?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And the
yeah,
idea was that despite Chiang Kai-shek, whatever he would have done, he would have never been able to really hold over any of the region. Like it would have been fragmented somewhat. It was an interesting concept because you look at everything and it's like, yeah, Chiang Kai-shek, like you said, he was fighting a Game of Thrones. It was warlords, and the guy almost got killed so many times for doing it. Mao
yeah,
held in the back. He was in a great region. He was in a
yep.
very safe region compared to everyone else, and he was able to hold down and go through the education process, which worked right into his favor. But yeah, I'm trying to imagine Mao not winning. It actually is. It's incredible that he did win in a lot of ways too. But it's like
Talk
you
about
said,
a long shot.
the long game paid out. I mean, he let his enemies, like, let's be honest, he let his enemies fight and he let them bleed out before he really put in.
Yeah, there's the famous story of decades after the Civil War, he met some Japanese businessmen, and the Japanese businessmen said, "Hey, Mr. Mao, sorry about the invasion and like all the war and stuff." And Mao goes, "Hey, you don't need to apologize to me. If you hadn't invaded, how could I have beaten Chiang Kai-shek?"
Jeez, that is cynical.
I mean, it's a story. I don't know if it was ever actually said or not, but Mao was say what you will about him. He thought a couple steps ahead. He was playing chess, not checkers.
Yeah, and God, where was I read it? The work time that he put in was incredible. And it's actually similar to Stalin. He just wouldn't stop working. He burnt the midnight oil, as you say, and he just kept going. And that's how he overcame a lot of his political adversaries within the party at the beginning, because he wasn't head honcho right away. Like he had to fight a little bit, which is
Yeah, he
surprising.
had to fight a lot. He didn't really become the top dog until after the Long March.
Yeah, he's lucky.
And
He's
yeah,
a lot of
and
luck.
just to survive the Long March, that means, the Long March had what, 90% casualties, 99% casualties. You got to be pretty lucky. So if that's not the mandate of heaven, I don't know what is.
It's so funny when you have Westerners who, even historians who've typically done the European War, and then they find out, oh, the Eastern Front, what the casualties are like. It's like, oh my God, 95% of the casualties in this war, it's in the Eastern Front. And then they're they're not
80%
talking about
of the
Pacific.
casualties. Yeah, 80% of the German casualties took place in Russia.
Yeah. And then they're like, oh, well, what? Oh, yeah, this Asian war, that's not part of this equation. How much did they lose? And it's like, what?
Yeah. Learning about Chinese history is a trip because nowadays we think of China as being one country. And this is an idea that's extremely, strongly perpetuated. It's like fiercely advocated for by the Chinese government for obvious reasons. But if you look at the scale and scope of Chinese history, you look at the numbers, look at the distances and the diversity of culture and even of language and probably even of genetic diversity, China is kind of like a world unto itself. When you say China, that's like the same as saying Europe, or probably not as much as saying Africa, but it's huge. It's almost, it's almost like an entire mini universe.
I had drinks with an Indian historian once, because I don't know much about Indian history. Sorry to my viewers. I'm going to learn it for this.
Embarrassingly uneducated about Indian history.
And he explained it to me like this. He said, India isn't a real thing. He's like,
it's not.
A bunch of countries.
The British made it up.
Yeah. He's like, we got smushed into this thing called a country called India. He's like, we all have different religions. We have different dialects, different languages. He's like, we're nothing alike. And he goes, they force us to be a country. And he goes, and then they wonder why we have all these rebellions and all this. And then he said the same thing. He's like, it's like China. And at the time I wasn't educated in all of this, but it's somewhat similar. It's like the Manchu come in, they're over-reigning over this territory, but it's different people encompass it. It is extraordinary that they held it together the way they did.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, when you talk about China, it's like talking about the Roman Empire.
Yeah, and exactly.
The Roman Empire, it once was a unified political body, but when you look at it today, it's all of Europe and North Africa and a big chunk of the Middle East. These encompass dozens of totally different cultures, languages, peoples, but they were all ruled together once upon a time. The difference is China is the Roman Empire that never went away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like all the scholars say, China always thinks 1,000 years into the future, I believe, is the phrase.
I haven't heard that.
I know Dan Carlin in a lot of his episodes, he was talking about how the visions of major generals and conquerors, it's like they're looking to survive the moment, to establish their dynasty. Maybe their children are going to take over, but it's always, he said,
maybe a generation.
Yeah, it's always been the Chinese have always had this idea of like, yes, it's going to be 1,000 years. And we might get hurt now, but we're always going to be alive. Our civilization will never fall. Always the long haul. There was like there was a special word for it, I forget. But yeah.
And that concept of like this enduring centrality that wasn't really seriously challenged until this conflict, this war that we're talking about now, where they're like, hey guys, this is really not working for us. And the Qing dynasty, it was plagued by all kinds of rebellions prior to this, but I think this conflict was the moment where things really started to get serious.
Well, actually, a great way to look at it is when you look at the military of the Qing dynasty up to this point, it actually was built to fight and quell rebellions, never to fight another nation. It was the first time that they were tested, and they weren't prepared to fight another nation, honestly, because of the embezzling of ammunitions. And like you said, they didn't have standard rifles, so a lot of them had different guns. So just there, you have different sorts of ammo. You have logistics of getting ammo.
Nightmare.
No officer could ever make it work. And it happened to the ships too. The ships had different ammo, or like this one viewer told me, concrete shells.
Yep. Concrete, sawdust, and opium.
Yes.
We haven't really talked about it here, but the influence, like the penetration of opium in Chinese society at this point, I think that will exert a subtle influence on everything that happens in both civil and military society. Although, in addition to my historical interest, I also work I spent a lot of time in nightlife and in harm reduction. And, of course, being Chinese, I was raised on the horror stories of the Opium War, how like opium was the poison of the nation, blah, blah, blah. But recently I've been getting educated from like a harm reduction angle. And what I've been learning is that like even heroin, which is of course an opiate, heroin, like people who are heroin quote unquote addicts, as long as they're given their like pure substances, of reliable potency and safe injection sites and safe injection routes, like clean needles and stuff, then they're able to live ordinary productive lives, and you couldn't even tell that they were opium users or heroin users. So I think, as much as I just said that the influence of opium on Chinese society was pervasive, I am recently starting to wonder like how much of that is actually the case and how much of that is kind of a narrative pushed by the Chinese state to kind of prop up this century of humiliation story.
It does fall into the blame game, because it's like another thing you can blame something on. During the Vietnam War, I forget what was the major atrocity, but they attributed it to the use of drugs as the reason why the Marines...
My
Yeah. And it was a scapegoat to cover up that guys were in the heat of war. A lot of their fellow comrades were killed at that moment, and they did horrible things as a result. And actually, since we're going on this long, I think possibly we could probably have another podcast later to talk about the end of this war, so I could cut it up into two, because I just realized I put out the first part, so people who might be listening to this podcast might be like, oh, we haven't even heard about
spoilers.
The naval battles, so we haven't touched anything too far, I found.
We haven't really gotten into the tactics. We haven't we've really just talked on like a very high level. And the one thing I did want to point out is you mentioned that the Qing military was primarily designed to crush rebellions. And that's true, but I don't want to cut the Manchu Empire. I don't want to sell them short because they did plenty of conquering in their early and vigorous days. But by the time that we're talking about, pretty much from the time of from the time the Qianlong Emperor died on, it was just rebellion after rebellion, and their offensive power had pretty much completely evaporated.
It's hard to even think about modernization and we call these things rebellions, and in people's minds like, oh, it's like a few people.
Yeah, they think it's like a riot.
These rebellions were serious. Like,
yeah, think civil war.
Yeah. I mean, the Taiping Rebellion is the most famous. It's the bloodiest conflict in human history until World War II, basically. Even World War I is kind of overshadowed by it.
Yeah, I've heard second most lethal conflict, third most lethal conflict. It's hard to say because it's hard to get reliable casualty numbers in any war, and it's especially hard to get reliable casualty numbers in a ginormous civil war where the basic functions of the state have started to decay.
Yeah. And I didn't, it's funny looking back, I think it was 45-minute episode on it, and I couldn't even touch most of it. I didn't touch the religious part of it because I honestly had to cut something. I had a 20-page script, and I could only do like 12 pages, honestly. And for the part 2 of this episode, I'm at 10 pages, and I'm worried because I know it's going to be past 20 minutes, and I don't know what I'm going to do. I might just kill myself, shoot myself in the foot, and keep it as it is, but we'll see.
I mean, your hardcore fans will stick through it. The nice thing is, if people are using YouTube Red and they're going for a long drive, then it's nice to throw it on and listen. But unfortunately, YouTube, the way it's set up, it's tough to get people to commit to a video over, I don't know what the sweet spot is.
It's
10
like
minutes, 15 minutes?
10, 15, yeah. You lose people after 15.
Yeah, I mean, even myself, I consider myself anything but casual. But if it's the middle of the workday and I just need to take a break for some, like a short break in between tasks at work, I'm not going to watch a 45-minute documentary for it.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because that's exactly how I consume this too. If I'm like, and the person knows this, there's a channel, History of China. I watch him.
Oh, that's a great channel. Exactly. That's a great channel.
I watch him for research, and I complimented him on his part 1 of the Sino-Japanese War, because I really wanted to see what he had to say, because it was more the Chinese perspective. And he replied to me. He said, "Oh, you're the parrot guy." So I was like, "Oh, you've seen me." Yeah. And oh my God, it's like his stuff is on point because his narration's perfect, and he hits the time zone. He does do 20-minute plus, though. I notice. And especially with his part 2 of the Sino-Japanese War, I know what his sources are just by watching his stuff. And I try to be different than the competitors. So I went a little different, but he messed up. I'll say that. Well, he made a few mistakes, and I know why. It's just because he had older sources on a few things. A little nitpicking, but yeah. I mean, but he's still great YouTube channel.
I mean, ultimately, if we want to be unassailable, then we have to go to the primary sources, and that's for real historians. We're YouTubers,
which I am not. I have the professor who got me my job today. His name is Max Bergholz, if he's ever out there, and he's a historian of Yugoslavia, more on he's specifically Bosnia and the genocides that took place there. That interesting course. I have a lot of background in that now. And he told me, you're not a historian if you do not speak the language, and if you have not actually gone into people's homes, into their kitchens, and asked them what they saw. And that's what he did.
That's why Dan Carlin insists on saying he's not a historian. He's a fan of history.
I like how he does that, because I honestly want to do the same thing. Because, I have a degree in history, but for my work, I use my other degree, which is in neuroscience. I'm more of a history lover, but I wouldn't consider myself a
history fan, history communicator, history popularizer, but I'm a long way from a real historian. It's like, did you know George St. Pierre, right?
Mm-hmm. I've seen him.
He did a podcast with Joe Rogan where he talked about his other love beyond mixed martial arts, which was paleontology.
Yeah, I know. It's funny.
Yeah, and he said after he retired from mixed martial arts, he went to dig up dinosaurs, and there he realized he is no paleontologist. He likes to learn about paleontology, But when it comes time to like actually doing the research, he doesn't have time for it. He doesn't have the patience, so he doesn't have it in him to be a real paleontologist.
Oh, of course, I love Georges St. Pierre because, you know, I've seen him in real life. He's like the biggest hero of the region I live in, right? But I imagine you saw, was it Captain America 2 Winter Soldier? He has like a cameo.
I haven't seen it, but I've heard he's in it.
Oh my God. He was supposed to play a French guy. And if you're Quebecois, like he speaks like I don't want to besmirch his character, but he spoke like a Quebecois, and he, like, there's no buying the fact that he speaks French, and it's like everybody in the theater
They're full
was
Americans,
laughing.
but no one else.
A full theater of that Quebecois. I was there watching it, and the laughter, like him responding to Captain. Yeah, love him. One of the greatest fighters of our time too. Like,
Absolutely,
he really rocked it.
absolutely. Yeah, like a true martial artist.
Yeah. All right. You know what? I think we can probably. God, it's been over 45 minutes, I'd say.
Oh yeah.
But
It's like an hour 15.
This has been a ton of fun, and I'm so glad I finally got to speak to you. And I hope, if you're interested, maybe at some point in the future, if you find time, we could actually do one more on this event and talk about, you know, why the naval battles went the way they went and the horrible end results and why it led to more war.
Oh, it would be my great pleasure. Thank you for having me here, Craig.
And please plug yourself again.
Oh, yes. Dispatches from the Armchair. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, and you can follow us on Facebook if you'd like to speak to me or my co-host, Mike, who is, in my opinion, he's the heart and soul of that podcast. So I couldn't get anywhere without him. If you ever do a podcast, if you ever want to speak more on Russia, like maybe the Russo-Japanese War, I'm sure he'd be more than happy to jump on too.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, that's gonna be a big episode. I'm really excited for the Boxer Rebellion. I'm gonna tell the audience right now, I don't know much.
A lot of sad stories about China.
I'm very weak when it comes to the Boxer Rebellion because from my learning, it was always, oh yeah, Japan, they had a little bit of vested interest. Yeah, they were there, but that's it. Like the Japanese, I never read any in-depth sources on it. I've never seen the Chinese perspective on it, which I imagine is horrible. It's tragic. And yeah, I'm really excited to touch that soon.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about any and all of that. You know, the Boxer Rebellion is another sad story. A lot of tears to be shed for the Chinese people in the next several decades of this story. But there's a mostly happy ending at the end.
It's true. I mean, that's why they refer to it as the 100 Years of Humiliation.
You're right,
which
right.
It's one of the most epic titles I've ever heard.
Yeah, never again.
And
all right.
That's been the Pacific War Channel. Over and out.